The surveyor's stakes had long since rotted away, but the creek still ran warm through the narrow valley in Wyoming territory. In the spring of 1847, two young women stood at the edge of that water, holding a deed to land that everyone said was worthless. They were orphans. They were alone. And they were about to do something that would make every neighbor within 20 miles call them fools. But this story doesn't begin at that creek. It begins 3 months earlier, in a small cemetery in Missouri, where Willa Ashford stood beside her younger sister Della, watching dirt fall onto their grandmother's coffin. Constance Ashford had been the only family they had left. Their parents had died in the cholera outbreak of 1840, taken within 3 days of each other, when Willa was 19 and Della was just 13. The disease had swept through their town like wildfire that summer, claiming 17 lives in 2 weeks. Willa still remembered the smell of the sick room, the sound of her mother's labored breathing, the moment when her father's hand had gone still in hers. For 7 years after that terrible summer, their grandmother had been everything to them: mother, father, teacher, protector. She had raised them in a small house on the edge of town, teaching Willa to be strong and practical, teaching Della to find beauty even in difficult things. She had worked as a seamstress until her fingers grew too stiff, then taken in laundry until her back gave out. Every penny she earned went toward keeping her granddaughters fed, clothed, and safe. Now she was gone, and the two sisters stood alone in the world. The minister spoke words that Willa barely heard. She was 26 years old, tall and lean from years of hard work, with calloused hands and a jaw that set firm when she was determined. Her dark hair was pulled back severely from her face, and her eyes, grey like winter sky, showed nothing of what she felt inside. Beside her, Della wept quietly. At 20, Della was softer than her sister, with gentle brown eyes that noticed every bird and flower, every shift of light through clouds. She had their mother's gift for making any space feel like home, and their mother's tender heart. Between them sat Copper, their grandmother's dog. The old hound was 8 years old, his muzzle going grey, his joints stiff with age. He had refused to leave the graveside since they arrived, sitting with his head low, as if he understood exactly what was happening. Every few minutes he would look up at the coffin and whine softly, then look at the sisters as if asking them to explain why his person wasn't coming back. After the service, the mourners drifted away.
This land is your future. Never sell. No matter what anyone tells you, no matter how impossible it seems, never sell.
One by one. A few offered condolences. Fewer offered help. The Ashford sisters had no other relatives, no connections, no one to turn to. They were, in every sense that mattered, on their own. The lawyer found them as they were preparing to leave. His name was Mr. Pemberton, a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He carried a leather case that contained everything their grandmother had left behind. There wasn't much money, he explained apologetically, barely enough to cover the funeral costs and a few months of modest living. There was the small house which would need to be sold to settle the remaining debts. There were a few pieces of jewelry, a Bible with the family tree inscribed on the first page, some books that had belonged to their grandfather. And there was a deed to 40 acres of land in Wyoming territory. Willa stared at the document, her hands trembling slightly. She had never heard her grandmother mention owning land out west. The deed was dated 1842, purchased for $73, paid in full. The property was located near a place called Red Creek, in a valley that the document described as having excellent water access. There was also a letter. The envelope was addressed to both sisters in their grandmother's careful handwriting, the letters slightly shaky with age, but still clear. Willa opened it with trembling fingers and began to read aloud, her voice catching on the first words. "My dear girls," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I have gone to join your grandfather and your parents, and all those who went before us. Do not grieve too long. I have lived a full life, and my greatest joy was watching you grow into the women you have become." The letter spoke of their grandfather, who had died before either sister was born. His name was Thomas Ashford, and he had been a miner from Cornwall, England. He had come to America in 1825 seeking a better life than the tin mines could offer. But he had brought with him something more valuable than any ore. He had brought knowledge. In Cornwall, their grandmother wrote, the miners had learned secrets about the earth that most people had forgotten. They knew how rock and water and soil behaved. They knew how to build structures that lasted for generations. They knew how to work with the land instead of against it. Before he died, Thomas had left his wife a journal filled with his observations and techniques, and he had made her promise to buy land in Wyoming, where he believed the earth held special properties that would make a good home for their family. He had read accounts from trappers and explorers who spoke of warm springs and strange thermal features in that territory. He believed that with his knowledge, a family could thrive there in ways that others could not. Constance had kept that promise. She had saved for years, denying herself small comforts, working extra hours, putting aside penny after penny until she had enough. She had bought the land sight unseen and held on to it through every hardship. She had always planned to take her granddaughters there one day, when they were old enough, when the time was right. The letter ended with words that Willa would remember for the rest of her life. This land is your future. Your grandfather knew things about building that others have forgotten. His journal will guide you. Never sell. No matter what anyone tells you, no matter how impossible it seems, never sell. The land
It's warm! How is this possible?
will provide for you if you let it. Trust in what Thomas knew and trust in yourselves. You are stronger than you believe. Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat uncomfortably. He felt obligated to tell them, he said, that the land was considered nearly worthless. A creek ran directly through the middle of the property, dividing it into two strips so narrow that no one could build a proper structure on either side. Several buyers had approached Mrs. Ashford over the years, offering to take the property off her hands. She had refused them all. Willa looked at Della. Della looked at Willa. They had no family left. They had no home once the house was sold. They had no prospects, no suitors, no path forward that anyone could see. They had nothing but each other, an old dog, a mysterious deed, and their grandfather's journal. That night, in the small house that would soon belong to someone else, Willa opened the journal for the first time. It was a revelation. The pages were filled with detailed drawings and careful notes written in the precise hand of a man who had spent his life observing the world around him. There were sketches of support structures and foundation techniques, diagrams showing how heat moved through different materials, Notes on the properties of various types of wood, which ones resisted rot, which ones grew stronger when exposed to certain conditions. One section was devoted entirely to water. Thomas Ashford had been fascinated by the warm springs he had encountered in Cornwall's mines. Water that flowed over volcanic rock deep underground, he wrote, emerged warm year-round, regardless of the weather above. The Cornish miners had learned to use this phenomenon, channeling warm water through their underground spaces to keep them habitable even in the coldest months. Such water is a gift from the earth itself, he had written. A man who builds with it rather than against it will never know cold. Willa read that passage 3 times, her heart beating faster with each reading. Then she turned to Della, who had been watching her with anxious eyes. "We're going to Wyoming," she said. 3 weeks later, they sold the house, paid the debts, and packed their remaining belongings into a sturdy wagon. They kept the furniture that had been in the family for generations, the quilts their grandmother had made, the books, the Bible, the jewelry. Everything else they sold for travel money. The morning they left Missouri, the sky was grey and threatening rain. Willa sat on the wagon seat with the reins in her hands, Della beside her, Copper lying in the back among their belongings. The old dog had been reluctant to leave the house where he had spent his whole life, but he had followed them in the end. He always followed them. The journey from Missouri to Wyoming took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of rutted roads and swollen rivers. 6 weeks of sleeping in the wagon under canvas stretched tight against the rain. 6 weeks of cooking over campfires and eating beans and hardtack until they both dreamed of fresh bread. It was hard traveling for 2 young women alone. At every stop, men told them they were foolish, reckless, asking for trouble. 2 girls with no escort, no male protection, no one to look after them. They would be robbed. They would be attacked. They would die on the trail, and no one would ever find their bones. Willa listened to these warnings with her jaw set and her eyes steady. She had learned long ago that the world did not make space for women who waited for permission. If she and Della were going to survive, they would have to make their own way. Each evening, when they made camp, Della would read aloud from their grandfather's journal, while Willa tended the fire. The more they read, the more they understood what Thomas Ashford had been trying to tell them. He had believed that knowledge, carefully applied, could overcome almost any obstacle. He had believed that the old ways, the ways that people had used for centuries before modern conveniences made them forget, still held power. One entry, dated 1838, described the warm springs in detail. Thomas had encountered them in the deepest parts of the Cornish mines, where the earth's heat seeped up through cracks in the rock. The water that emerged was not hot enough to burn, but warm enough to keep a man comfortable even in the coldest conditions. In such places, he wrote, a man could survive the worst winter imaginable. The earth itself becomes his hearth. At a trading post in Nebraska, they encountered a man who would become important to their story, though not in the way he intended. His name was Silas Hartwell, and he was perhaps 50 years old, well-dressed, in clothes.
What if we build over it?
He wrote it all down, every step.
Clothes that marked him as wealthy, with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. He owned a large ranch in Wyoming territory, he explained when he struck up conversation with them. And he couldn't help but notice 2 young ladies traveling alone. It wasn't safe, he said. It wasn't proper. Where were they headed? When Willa told him, his expression changed. A flicker of something crossed his face, surprise perhaps, or calculation. He knew that land, he said, knew it well. It bordered his own property to the north, and he felt obligated to tell them the truth. "That land is worthless, miss," he said, leaning against the trading post counter with an air of friendly concern. "Creek runs right through the middle. You can't build on either side. Too narrow. Your grandmother got swindled, I'm afraid. Someone sold her land that no one else would buy." Willa felt Della stiffen beside her, but she kept her own voice calm and steady. "We'll see for ourselves," she said. Hartwell smiled. It was a pleasant smile, but his eyes remained calculating. "Tell you what," he offered. "I'll give you $50 for it right now. Save you the trouble of going all that way just to turn around and come back. That's more than fair for worthless land, and you ladies could use the money for your journey home." Willa looked at him directly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "No," she said. "Thank you, but no." Hartwell's smile faded slightly. He was not accustomed to being refused, especially not by young women with no resources and no protection. "Think about it," he said. "The offer stands. But I'll tell you this, Miss Ashford. You'll be back begging me to take it off your hands before first snow. Mark my words." Willa gathered the supplies they had come for and left without another word, but Della noticed how her sister's hands were shaking as she guided the horses back to their wagon. "Who was that man?" Della asked quietly. "Someone who wants what we have," Willa replied, "and we're not going to give it to him." They arrived at their land in mid-May when the Wyoming spring was just beginning to turn the brown hills green. The valley was beautiful in its harsh way, nestled between rolling terrain that stretched toward distant mountains still capped with snow. Wildflowers dotted the slopes in patches of yellow and purple. Birds sang in the scattered cottonwood trees that lined the creek banks. The air was clean and cold and smelled of sage, and right through the middle of their 40 acres ran Red Creek. Willa pulled the wagon to a stop at the edge of their property and stared. The creek was perhaps 12 feet across at its widest point. It flowed from north to south in a gentle curve, its waters clear enough to see the stones on the bottom. On either side of the water, the land rose slightly before flattening out into usable ground, but the usable ground was narrow, very narrow. She climbed down from the wagon and paced it off, counting her steps. 20 feet on the east side, 20 feet on the west, just barely enough room for a small structure, and that was only if you built right up to the water's edge. Della joined her, Copper limping along behind. The old dog had grown stiffer during the journey, his joints protesting the constant motion of the wagon, but he had made it. And now he stood on the bank of Red Creek, his nose twitching at the unfamiliar scents. For a long moment the sisters stood in silence, looking at the land their grandmother had saved for years to buy. The land she had believed would be their future. Della spoke first, her voice small and defeated. "It really is worthless, isn't it?" Willa didn't answer. She was thinking about Silas Hartwell's smile, thinking about how many people had told them this trip was foolish, thinking about how they had nowhere else to go, how they had spent nearly all their money getting here, how they couldn't afford to turn back even if they wanted to. A sound caught her attention, splashing. She turned to see Copper wading into the creek, something he never did. The old dog hated water, always had. He would go miles out of his way to avoid crossing a stream. But now he stood chest-deep in the current, and his tail was wagging for the first time since they had left Missouri. Della noticed, too. She stepped closer to the water's edge, curious, then knelt down and plunged her hand into the creek. Her gasp made Willa's heart skip. "Willa, feel this!" Willa knelt beside her sister and put her hand in the water. For a moment, she didn't understand what she was feeling. The water should have been cold. It was May, yes, but this was Wyoming, and the creek was fed by snowmelt from the mountains. It should have been frigid, cold enough to numb her fingers in seconds. But it wasn't cold at all. It was warm, not hot, not like a bath or a hot spring that would scald, but warm, comfortable, pleasant, like water that had been sitting in the sun all day, except that the sun was barely up, and the morning air still held the chill of night. Willa pulled her hand out and looked at it, as if expecting to see something different about her skin. Then she plunged it back in, moving it through the current, confirming what she had felt. "How is this possible?" Della whispered, and suddenly Willa remembered the passage from their grandfather's journal. Water that flows over volcanic rock deep underground emerges warm year-round, a gift from the earth itself. She scrambled back to the wagon and dug through their belongings until she found the journal. She flipped through the pages frantically until she found the section on warm springs. "Look," she said, showing Della the passage. "This is what Grandfather wrote about. Water heated by volcanic rock. It stays warm all year, no matter how cold it gets above ground." Della read the passage, her brow furrowed. "But what good does it do us? We still can't build a house. There's no room on either side." Willa stood slowly, her mind racing. She looked at the narrow strips of land on either side of the creek. Too narrow to build on. That was what everyone said. That was why the land was worthless. But what if they didn't build beside the water? The idea came to her fully formed, like a gift from her grandfather's spirit, like he was standing beside her and whispering in her ear. What if they built over it? Della thought her sister had lost her mind. "Over the water," she repeated, staring at Willa as if she had suggested they sprout wings and fly. "You want to build our house over the creek?" Willa grabbed the journal and flipped through the pages until she found what she was looking for. Their grandfather's detailed sketches of Cornish mining structures built over underground streams to take advantage of their warmth. Platforms supported by deep-set posts, with openings that allowed access to the water below. "Look," she said, showing Della the drawings. "He did it in the mines."
That water's gonna rot your floorboards inside a year. You'll catch pneumonia.
Built workspaces right over flowing water. The warm water heated the air from below. The miners could work in their shirt sleeves even in winter, even deep underground, where it should have been freezing. Della studied the sketches. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly. "But those were mines," she said, "not homes. How would we even know how to do this?" He wrote it all down. Willa's voice was gaining strength now, the way it always did when she had made up her mind about something. Every step, every measurement, every technique. He spent his whole life learning how to build things that worked with the earth instead of against it. And he left it all for us, Della. He left us everything we need. Della looked at the creek, then at the narrow strips of useless land on either side, then back at her sister. "People will think we've lost our minds," she said quietly. Willa smiled. It was the first genuine smile she had worn since their grandmother's funeral, and it transformed her stern face into something almost beautiful. "Let them think what they like," she said. "We'll be warm while they're hauling frozen water and feeding their fires day and night. We'll be comfortable while they're shivering in their drafty cabins, and when spring comes they'll see who was really the fool." She put her hand on Della's shoulder. "Grandmother believed in this land," she said. "Grandfather dreamed of what we could build here. Are we really going to prove them wrong?" Della was silent for a long moment. Then she squared her shoulders and lifted her chin. "No," she said. "We're going to prove everyone else wrong." The mockery began immediately. Their nearest neighbor was a man named Marcus Whitmore, who had lived in the valley for 43 years. He was a grizzled man in his 50s with a weathered face and hands like leather from decades of working the land. He had buried 2 wives, raised 5 children who had all moved away to find their fortunes elsewhere, and he considered himself an expert on everything related to surviving in Wyoming. He rode over the first day. They began marking out the foundation, sitting on his horse and watching with undisguised disbelief as Willa drove stakes into the creek bed. "You're building in the water?" he asked, his voice carrying the slow drawl of a man who had seen many strange things, but never anything quite like this. "Over it," Willa replied, not pausing in her work. Whitmore shook his head slowly, the way a man might shake his head at a child who had said something foolish. "That water's going to rot your floorboards inside a year," he said. "You'll catch pneumonia from the damp, all that moisture rising up through your floor. You'll be sick all winter long. Won't last 1 season, mark my words." "The water's warm," Della said, coming to stand beside her sister. "Feel it yourself if you don't believe us. It flows over volcanic rock underground. It will heat the house from below." Whitmore looked at her like she had spoken in a foreign language. Then he actually laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Warm water's still water, miss. Still damp, still wet, still going to rot your wood and make you sick." He shook his head again. "I've lived here 43 years. Nobody builds over water. There's a reason for that." He rode away without waiting for a response, and Willa knew that by evening every household within 10 miles would know what the Ashford sisters were planning. She was right. Within a week, a steady stream of visitors came to watch and comment. Some were merely curious, drawn by the novelty of 2 young women attempting such an unusual project. Most were skeptical, offering well-meaning advice that always boiled down to the same message. Stop. Give up. This is impossible. A few were openly cruel. A young man named Ezra Tanner, perhaps 22 years old, with the cocky swagger of youth, came with a group of his friends one afternoon. They sat on their horses on the bank and watched Willa work in the water, driving posts into the creek bed with a post-hole digger. $20 says it collapses before Christmas," Ezra called out to his friends, loud enough for Willa to hear. "I'll take that bet," another young man shouted back. "I say it won't last till Thanksgiving." They laughed and rode away, their mockery echoing across the valley long after they had disappeared from sight. The general store in town started referring to the project as Ashford's Folly. The name spread quickly, repeated with knowing smiles and shaking heads. Those poor girls. Lost their grandmother and their minds at the same time. Such a shame. Reverend Caldwell came one Sunday afternoon, his black coat dusty from the ride, his face arranged in an expression of gentle concern. He was a thin man with kind eyes and a soft voice, the sort of minister who genuinely cared about his flock. He stood on the bank and watched Willa work for several minutes before he spoke. "Perhaps the Lord is testing your judgment, child," he said finally. "There are easier paths in this world, safer paths. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. We're not trying to prove anything, Reverend, Willa replied, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. We're trying to build a home. The Reverend sighed and promised to pray for them. Willa thanked him politely and went back to work. But not everyone who came was unkind. Old Jacob Morrison was the oldest man in the valley, nearly 80 years old, with skin like crumpled paper and eyes that had seen things most people could only imagine. He had come to Wyoming as a young man, before it was even a territory, when the only other inhabitants were native tribes and the occasional trapper. He came alone on foot, leaning on a walking stick carved from a single piece of oak. He didn't say a word at first. He just stood on the bank and watched Willa work for nearly an hour, his ancient eyes following every movement with keen attention. When he finally spoke, his voice was like gravel grinding against stone. "My father built like this," he said, "back in Virginia, before I was born, over a spring that ran warm year-round. Warmest house in the county, people used to say." Willa stopped working and looked at him. His words were the first encouragement she had received from anyone in the valley. "Did it last?" she asked. Jacob Morrison smiled, revealing gaps where teeth had once been. "Still standing," he said. "My grandson lives in it now. Goes on 90 years old, that house, and it'll be standing 90 more when we're all dust." He turned and walked away, his walking stick tapping against the stones. Willa watched him go, feeling something loosen in her chest that she hadn't even realized was tight. It was the first time anyone had told her she might not be crazy. Now, I need to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever worked on something that everyone told you was impossible? Have you ever kept going when the whole world said you should stop? Have you ever held on to a dream so tightly that the mockery and the doubt just made you grip it harder? If you have, then you understand what Willa Ashford was feeling in that Wyoming spring of 1847. The exhaustion that went bone deep after long days of physical labor. The doubt that crept in during the quiet hours of the night when she lay awake wondering if everyone was right and she was wrong. The loneliness of being the only one who could see what she was trying to build. But also the fierce, burning determination to prove that she was right. The stubborn refusal to give up on the dream her grandmother had kept alive for years. The knowledge, deep in her bones, that her grandfather's wisdom had been passed down to her for a reason. If you're still with me, if this story is speaking to something in your heart, I'd love to know. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Tell me about a time when you kept going when everyone said you should quit. It means more than you know to hear from people who understand what it's like to be underestimated. Now, let me tell you what happened next, because the hardest part was still to come. By early June, Willa had established a routine that would govern her days for the entire summer. She rose before dawn each day when the sky was still grey and the air held the chill of night. She ate a cold breakfast of whatever Della had prepared the evening before, bread and dried meat, and sometimes a precious egg from the chickens they had brought in the wagon. She drank strong coffee boiled over a small fire, the bitter taste helping to wake her fully. Then she went to work. The first phase was the foundation posts. According to her grandfather's journal and her own calculations, she needed 16 posts total, 8 on each side of the creek, driven deep into the rocky bed. Each post was a massive log of pine, 18 inches in diameter, cut from trees she had felled herself in the forested foothills 5 miles from their property. The tree cutting alone had taken 3 weeks. 3 weeks of hiking to the forest before dawn, selecting the straightest trees she could find, felling them with an axe she had to sharpen every evening.
$75. Take the money, go back to Missouri before winter kills you.
3 weeks of stripping bark and trimming branches, then hitching the logs to their horses and dragging them back to the property one at a time. Her hands had blistered, then bled, then blistered again. Her shoulders ached constantly from the weight of the axe. Her back screamed in protest every morning when she rose from her bedroll. But she kept working because there was no one else to do it, and because the work had to be done. Now came the harder part, driving those massive posts into the creek bed. She worked waist-deep in the current, using a post-hole digger she had bought in town for a price that had made her wince. The warm water was actually a blessing in those long days, keeping her comfortable even as she labored under the hot summer sun. Most people working in a cold stream would have been numb within minutes, unable to continue. Willa could work for hours, the warm current flowing around her like a gentle embrace. But the work itself was brutal. The creek bed was rocky, which was good for stability, but terrible for digging. Each post hole had to be excavated by hand, stone by stone, the larger rocks pried loose and hauled to the bank, while Willa stood in water up to her chest. Then the post had to be positioned perfectly vertical, checked with a plumb line and secured in place with smaller stones packed tight around the base. Each post took 2 full days to install. 2 days of back-breaking labor for a single piece of the foundation, and she needed 16 of them. She checked and rechecked her measurements obsessively, remembering her grandfather's words from the journal. A foundation is a promise to everything built above it. Make the promise true. Della watched her sister with a mixture of admiration and worry. She did what she could to help, bringing food and water to the creek bank, sharpening tools, preparing materials. But the work in the water was beyond her strength, and both sisters knew it. What Della could do was prepare for the life they would live once the cabin was complete. She had brought seeds from Missouri, carefully wrapped in cloth and stored in a tin box to keep them dry during the journey. Now she cleared a patch of ground near their tent and began planting a garden. Carrots, onions, beans, squash, potatoes. The soil was rocky and hard, but she worked it day after day, removing stones, adding compost from their horses' manure, coaxing the earth into something that might support life. She also explored the land around their property, learning what grew wild that might be useful. She found mint growing along the creek banks, its sharp scent filling the air when she brushed against it. She found sage on the hillsides, its silvery leaves soft as velvet. She found yarrow with its clusters of tiny white flowers, which her grandmother had used to treat wounds and reduce fever. Everything useful, she gathered, everything that might help them survive the winter to come. By the end of June, all 16 posts stood in place, marching in pairs down the length of what would become their home. Willa stood on the bank and looked at them, her hands raw and blistered, her back aching, her heart full. It was beginning to look like something. July brought the hottest days of summer, and with them a disaster that nearly ended everything. Willa was working on the sill beams, the heavy timbers that would connect the foundation posts and support the floor above. She had traded work to a sawmill owner for the lumber, spending 3 days helping him cut and stack timber in exchange for the beams she needed. Now she was fitting them into place, balancing on the posts above the flowing water, working with a level and a saw to get each joint exactly right. The morning had been productive. She had fitted 2 beams already, and she was feeling confident, perhaps too confident. She was reaching for her hammer, which she had set on a nearby post, when her foot slipped on the wet wood. The fall happened so fast that she didn't have time to cry out. One moment she was standing, balanced and steady. The next she was tumbling through the air. She hit the water hard, her body twisting, her leg catching on something beneath the surface. Pain exploded through her ankle and knee, white-hot and blinding. She gasped, swallowing water, thrashing against the current. For a terrifying moment she couldn't find the bottom, couldn't orient herself, couldn't tell which way was up. Then her hands found stone, and she pushed herself above the surface, coughing and gasping. Della heard the splash and came running. She found Willa half submerged in the creek, her face white with pain, her left leg twisted at an angle that made Della's stomach turn. It took both of them, working together, to get Willa to the bank. Every movement brought fresh waves of agony. By the time they reached dry ground, Willa was shaking uncontrollably, her teeth chattering despite the warm day. Della examined the leg with trembling hands, trying to remember everything their grandmother had taught them about injuries. The ankle was swelling rapidly, already turning purple and black. The knee was worse. Willa couldn't straighten her leg without screaming, and the joint felt wrong somehow, loose and unstable. "I'll ride to town," Della said, her voice high with fear. "Find a doctor." "No!" Willa's voice was strained but firm, each word forced out through clenched teeth. "We can't afford a doctor, and we can't lose the time. If we don't finish before winter—" She didn't complete the sentence. She didn't have to. Both sisters knew what winter in Wyoming would mean if they didn't have shelter. "Then what do we do?" Della asked. Willa closed her eyes. When she opened them again, her gaze was steady despite the pain. "You'll have to continue without me." The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Della felt panic rising in her chest, threatening to overwhelm her. She had never built anything in her life. She could barely swing a hammer. The idea of her continuing the construction alone was absurd, impossible, laughable. But she looked at her sister's face, saw the pain and the fear that Willa was trying so hard to hide, and she understood something important. Willa wasn't asking her to be brave. She wasn't asking her to be strong or capable or skilled. She was simply telling her that bravery and strength and capability were already inside her, waiting to be used. All Della had to do was find them. "All right," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Tell me what to do." For 3 weeks, Della Ashford built a house. She rose before dawn, just as her sister had done. She put on Willa's work gloves, which were too big for her smaller hands. She walked to the creek and stared at the partially completed structure, trying to understand the logic of it, the way each piece connected to the next. The first day was a disaster. She dropped tools in the water and had to fish them out. She measured wrong and cut a beam too short, wasting precious lumber. She hit her thumb with a hammer so hard that her nail turned black, and she sat down on the bank and cried for 20 minutes, while copper pressed against her side and whined in sympathy. But she got up again. She always got up again. The second day was a little better. She managed to fit one sill beam into place, checking it against the level a dozen times before she was satisfied. It wasn't perfect. She could see the tiny imperfections, the places where a more experienced builder would have done better. But it was solid. It would hold. The third day, she finished another beam. By the end of the first week, something had changed inside her. Her hands had stopped shaking when she picked up tools. Her measurements were more confident, her cuts more precise. She was beginning to understand the rhythm of the work, the way her grandfather's journal described each step, the way each piece connected to create something stronger than its parts. She talked to Copper constantly as she worked. The old dog had appointed himself supervisor of the construction, lying on the bank with his greying head on his paws, watching her every move with patient eyes. "What do you think, boy?" she would ask, stepping back to examine her work. "Is that straight enough? Does that look right to you?" Copper would wag his tail slowly, and Della would decide that it was good enough to continue. Willa watched from the tent where she lay, propped up on blankets, her injured leg elevated on a pile of their belongings. She couldn't walk, couldn't even stand without help. Every day that passed was torture for her, being still and helpless while her baby sister did the work that should have been hers. But she also saw something happening that she had never expected. Della was changing. The softness that had always defined her wasn't gone, but it had been joined by something new, a firmness in her jaw when she encountered a problem, a steadiness in her gaze when she faced a challenge, a quiet determination that reminded Willa painfully and beautifully of their grandmother. When Marcus Whitmore rode by in the second week to see how the foolish project was coming along, expecting to find the whole thing abandoned, he found Della balanced on a beam above the water, fitting floor joists into place with competent hands. He stared for a long moment, his mouth slightly open. Then he turned his horse and rode away without saying a word. That night, Della came back to the tent with sawdust in her hair and pride in her eyes. "He didn't laugh," she told Willa. "He looked at what I was doing, and he didn't laugh." Willa reached out and squeezed her sister's calloused hand. "He's starting to wonder if he was wrong," she said. "They're all starting to wonder." By the end of July, Willa was able to walk again, slowly and with a limp that would take months to fully heal. She stood at the water's edge, leaning on a crutch Della had made from a forked branch, and looked at what her sister had accomplished. The entire floor frame was complete. The sill beams were in place, the joists were fitted, the structure was sound and level, and ready for the next phase. "You did this," Willa said softly. "You did all of this." Della stood beside her, her hands rough and blistered, her arms stronger than they had ever been. "We did this," she corrected. "Your plans? Grandfather's knowledge. I just swung the hammer." Willa shook her head. "No," she said. "You did something harder than swinging a hammer. You believed it was possible when everyone, including yourself, said it wasn't." She put her arm around her sister's shoulders, and they stood together, looking at the beginning of their home. August brought an unwelcome visitor. Silas Hartwell rode up to the construction site on a fine black horse, his clothes clean and pressed, his boots polished to a shine. He was a sharp contrast to the mud and sawdust and sweat that covered both Ashford sisters. He sat in his saddle for a long moment, studying the structure with calculating eyes before he spoke. "I heard about your injury, Miss Ashford," he said to Willa, his voice carrying false concern. "Terrible thing. I came to see if you'd reconsidered my offer." Willa straightened up despite the pain in her leg. "I have not." Hartwell's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Frustration, perhaps, or anger at being refused again. $75, he said. That's 50% more than I offered before. More than this land is worth, and we both know it. Take the money, go back to Missouri, start fresh, somewhere that makes sense. Why do you want this land so badly? Willa asked. The question had been bothering her for months. If it's worthless, why do you keep trying to buy it? The question seemed to catch Hartwell off guard. He was silent for a moment, his jaw working. I don't like waste, he said finally. I don't like seeing two young women throw their lives away on a fool's errand. This cabin of yours is going to fail. The water will rot the wood from below. The damp will make you sick, and when winter comes, when the real cold sets in, you'll freeze to death out here, with no one to help you. The water is warm, Della said, coming to stand beside her sister. Her voice was stronger now than it had been 3 months ago. It flows over volcanic rock underground. It will keep us warm all winter. Hartwell looked at her with something like pity. Warm water is still water, miss. Still damp. Still deadly. You'll see. He turned his horse, then paused and looked back over his shoulder. My offer won't last forever, he said. When you're ready to be reasonable, you know where to find me. He rode away, his horse's hooves kicking up dust that settled slowly over the construction site. Della watched him go, her face troubled. He really believes we're going to fail, she said. Willa picked up her hammer and went back to work. Good, she said. Let him believe it. When we prove him wrong, it will be all the sweeter. The walls went up through August and into September. Willa had recovered enough to work again, though she still favoured her injured leg and had to rest more often than she would have liked. But with both sisters working together, progress was swift. They used the saddle notch technique their grandfather had described in his journal. Each log was cut with a curved depression on the bottom that fit over the rounded top of the log below it. When done correctly, the logs locked together like puzzle pieces, creating tight seals at the corners that would hold back wind and weather. Between the logs, Della prepared the chinking. She gathered clay from the creek banks, mixed it with grass and small stones, and worked the thick paste into every gap between the logs. It was tedious work, requiring patience and attention to detail, but Della had discovered that she enjoyed it. There was something satisfying about filling those gaps, about knowing that each handful of chinking was another barrier against the cold. The floor had taken shape with its 3 carefully planned openings. Near what would be the front entrance, they had built a stone-lined pool about 4 feet across. This was where the creek entered the cabin, flowing in from outside through a channel Willa had lined with flat rocks. The pool would provide easy access to water for drinking and cooking without having to go outside. In the center of the cabin, another opening allowed access to the creek below, spanned by a small wooden bridge with simple railings. This would be the primary washing area where they could clean clothes and bathe throughout the year. And near the back, where the wood stove would eventually stand, a third opening allowed the water to flow out again, continuing its journey south. The warmth rising from this opening would help heat the stove area, reducing the amount of wood they would need to burn. Between these 3 openings, the creek flowed beneath the floor, invisible but present. Willa had built the floor with small gaps between the boards, not large enough to create a draft or be dangerous, but enough to allow the warmth from the water to rise into the living space above. The visitors continued to come, though less frequently now that the novelty had worn off. Marcus Whitmore stopped by, occasionally, watching the progress with an expression that had shifted from mockery to something more complicated. He no longer predicted immediate failure, but he still shook his head at the whole enterprise. Ezra Tanner rode by once with his friends, saw how far the construction had progressed, and rode away without making any bets. The joke didn't seem as funny anymore when the punchline refused to arrive. And then there was Hollis Fletcher. He was 24 years old, newly arrived in the valley from Pennsylvania. He had come west to stake his own claim, to build a life for himself far from the crowded cities of the East. He had heard about the crazy Ashford sisters and their impossible project, and he had come to see for himself. He didn't laugh. He didn't shake his head. He stood on the bank with his arms crossed, studying the construction with genuine interest and no apparent judgment. "How does the water not rot the wood?" he asked. Willa explained about the pine logs, how her grandfather had observed in the Cornish mines that wood submerged in warm mineral water actually became harder over time instead of softer. The minerals in the water penetrated the wood fibers, she said, strengthening them instead of breaking them down. Hollis listened carefully. He asked questions. He examined the foundation posts where they entered the water, the floor joists, the way the openings were framed. When he finally spoke, his words were simple. "I think you've built something remarkable, Miss Ashford." Willa thanked him, but she noticed that he wasn't looking at her when he said it. His eyes had drifted to where Della stood on the far side of the cabin, measuring a log for cutting. October arrived with a killing frost that turned the garden plants black overnight. Della had spent the previous weeks harvesting everything she could, storing vegetables in root cellars she had dug into the bank, drying herbs and hanging them from the rafters of the nearly completed cabin. They had beans and squash and onions and carrots, enough to supplement whatever meat Willa could hunt through the winter months. The cabin was nearly complete now. The walls stood solid and tight, the chinking carefully packed into every gap. The roof was perhaps the most critical element, built steep to shed snow, covered with split shakes that overlapped like fish scales to keep out the rain. The windows were a luxury they had barely been able to afford. 2 small-paned windows, one on each side of the cabin, and a glass panel in the door. Willa had traded 2 weeks of her labor to a glazier in town for the glass, working 14-hour days while her legs still ached. But it was worth it. On sunny days, light poured through those windows, filling the cabin with warmth and brightness. The door was thick planks of pine reinforced with iron cross braces, hung on hinges that Willa had forged herself at the blacksmith shop in town. She had worked through an entire night to get those hinges right, pumping the bellows and hammering the hot metal until her arms trembled with exhaustion. Inside, they had built the furniture they would need: a rough-hewn table and 2 benches, a sleeping platform raised a foot off the floor on one side of the cabin, large enough for both sisters and covered with a straw mattress that Della had sewn from canvas. Shelves along the back wall for their provisions, a smaller shelf near the stove for cooking implements. The stove itself was their greatest expense, a cast-iron box with a flat cooking surface, bought in town for a price that had taken most of their remaining money. Willa had built a hearth beneath it from creek stones, creating a fireproof platform near the rear water opening where the rising warmth would help fuel the fire. On the last day of October, they moved in. It was a simple ceremony, just the 2 sisters and an old dog walking through the door of the home they had built with their own hands. But it meant everything. Della lit a fire in the stove, while Willa checked the water openings one last time. The creek flowed through the cabin exactly as they had planned, entering through the front pool, passing beneath the floor, Exiting through the rear channel, steam rose gently from the center opening, carrying with it the warmth of the earth. That night, they sat at their rough table and ate the first meal in their new home. Venison stew that Della had made from a deer Willa had shot the week before. Fresh bread baked in a Dutch oven on the stove. Coffee, strong and black, boiled in a pot that had belonged to their grandmother. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Everything they wanted to say was in the walls around them, in the floor beneath their feet, in the warm water murmuring its endless song below. Let me pause here again because this moment matters. Willa and Della Ashford had been told they were foolish. They had been told they would fail. They had been told that what they were trying to do was impossible, that they should give up, that they should accept their limitations and settle for something less. They had ignored all of it. They had worked until their hands bled and their bodies ached. They had faced disaster and doubt and mockery, and they had kept going. Now they sat in the home they had built, warm and safe, while the October wind howled outside. If you're still with me, if this story is touching something in your heart, take a moment to hit that subscribe button. It helps more than you know. And stick with me, because what happens next is going to take your breath away. November brought the first real cold, and with it, the first true test of everything they had built. The temperature dropped below freezing for the first time on November the 3rd. Willa woke that morning to frost on the windows, thick white crystals that turned the glass opaque. Outside, the world had gone hard and brittle, every surface coated in ice. But inside the cabin, something remarkable was happening. The warm water flowing beneath the floor was doing exactly what Willa had hoped. Heat rose through the boards, spreading through the small space, keeping the temperature comfortable, even though the fire had burned low during the night. Willa checked the thermometer she had hung on the wall. Outside, it was 28 degrees. Inside, it was 54. She added wood to the stove and watched the temperature climb. Within an hour, the cabin was at 72 degrees, warm enough to work in shirt sleeves despite the freezing weather outside. They settled into the rhythms of frontier life as autumn gave way to early winter. Willa rose before dawn each day to feed the stove and start the coffee. While the cabin warmed, she checked the water openings, making sure no debris had accumulated to block the flow. The creek ran clear and constant, its warmth spreading upward through the gaps in the floorboards. Breakfast was simple, but filling. Most mornings, Della made cornmeal mush cooked with milk from their cow, sometimes sweetened with honey they had bought in town or mixed with dried berries she had gathered in autumn. On special mornings, she made flapjacks from their precious flour stores, serving them with butter she had churned herself. Coffee was a constant, strong, black, boiled in a battered pot. They drank it at the rough-hewn table, planning the day's work while steam rose from their cups. After breakfast, the work began. For Willa, this meant hunting when weather allowed, or the endless maintenance projects of frontier life. The horses and cow needed daily tending. Wood needed constant cutting and stacking. Tools needed mending. Leather harnesses needed oiling. For Della, the days revolved around the house. Cooking, cleaning, preserving, mending. The work never ended, but she found satisfaction in it that she had never expected. Every loaf of bread she baked was proof that they could sustain themselves. Every pot of soup was evidence that they would survive. The indoor water transformed their daily lives in ways they had only imagined before. Washing was nearly a daily task, but it required none of the back-breaking labor that their neighbors endured. While other women in the valley hauled buckets from frozen streams and heated them over fires, Della simply knelt by the center opening and dipped their clothes into the warm current. She scrubbed them against the smooth stones Willa had set around the pool's edge, rinsed them in the flowing water, and hung them to dry on a line strung across one corner of the cabin. By evening, everything was clean and ready to wear again. Bathing, too, became a weekly ritual rather than a seasonal luxury. While their neighbors might go months without a proper wash in winter, the Ashford sisters stayed clean and comfortable. Della would heat extra water on the stove to supplement the creek's warmth, screen herself with a blanket hung from the rafters, and take a proper bath in the center opening. It seemed like such a small thing, being able to stay clean. But it made all the difference. They felt human. They felt civilized. They felt like they were living, not just surviving. As November progressed, Willa focused on hunting. They needed meat to see them through the winter, and while they had some salt pork laid by, fresh venison would make the difference between merely getting by and eating well. She learned the land around their property as well as she knew her own hands. She discovered where the deer came to drink, which trails they used, which thickets they bedded down in during the day. She learned to read the signs they left behind, the tracks in the snow, the browse marks on shrubs, the scrapes on trees where bucks had rubbed their antlers. She learned patience. Sometimes she sat motionless for hours, tucked into a hiding spot with her rifle across her knees, waiting for the right shot. The cold would seep into her bones despite the warm clothes she wore. Her fingers would grow stiff, her legs would cramp, but she would wait. The buck came on a grey afternoon in mid-November, 3 days before everything changed. It was a 4-point with a heavy body that spoke of good feeding through the summer and fall. It approached the creek cautiously, testing the air for danger, its ears swiveling to catch any sound. Willa held her breath, watching through the iron sights of her rifle. The shot was clean, dropping the animal in its tracks. She field-dressed it where it fell, working quickly in the cold, then began the long work of hauling it home. The buck was heavy, close to 160 pounds, and even though the cabin was only a mile away, it was brutal work dragging the carcass over rough ground. She reached home as the light was failing, the deer draped across her shoulders, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Della heard her coming and threw open the door, her face breaking into a smile when she saw what Willa carried. "Good hunting," she said simply, but Willa could hear the relief beneath the words. This deer meant they wouldn't go hungry. This deer meant security against whatever winter might bring. They hung the carcass from a beam outside, high enough that predators couldn't reach it. The cold would keep the meat fresh until they could process it fully. That evening, Willa butchered the choicest cuts while Della prepared a feast. Venison steaks cooked with wild onions, carrots from the root cellar, gravy made from pan drippings thickened with flour. They ate until they were full for the first time in weeks, then sat by the stove with coffee cups in hand, watching the firelight dance on the walls. "We're going to make it," Della said quietly. "Through the winter, we're going to be all right." Willa reached over and took her sister's hand. "Better than all right," she agreed. The signs began 3 days later, on a Tuesday evening. Willa noticed first. The sky had turned a strange color as the sun set, yellow-grey with an eerie greenish tinge she had never seen before. The air felt different too, heavy and thick, charged with something waiting to happen. And Copper, who usually slept peacefully by the fire, was pacing the cabin restlessly. He would walk to the door and whine, then walk back to the stove, then return to the door again. His old eyes were troubled, and he refused to settle no matter how many times Della called him. "Something's wrong," Della said, watching the dog with concern. Willa stepped outside to check on the animals. The horses were nervous in their lean-to, stamping and tossing their heads. The cow had pressed herself into the corner of her shelter, her eyes rolling to show the whites. Even the chickens were agitated, making strange sounds as they huddled together in their coop. The next morning, old Jacob Morrison appeared on their doorstep. He had walked all the way from his cabin, nearly 2 miles, despite his age and the cold. He was breathing hard from the effort, leaning heavily on his walking stick, but his eyes were sharp and urgent. "Storm coming," he said without greeting or preamble. "Big one. Sky's got that color I remember from '62. My bones ache in a way they haven't in 20 years. He looked at Willa with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. "This one's going to be bad," he said. "Worse than anything you've known. Maybe worse than anything I've known. Get your animals in close. Stack your wood inside. Fill every container you have with water. And pray." He turned and began the long walk home before Willa could thank him. She spent the rest of that day preparing. She brought the horses and cow into the sturdiest shelter she could arrange, gave them extra feed, made sure they had water. She carried load after load of firewood into the cabin, stacking it along one wall until there was barely room to move. She filled every pot and bucket and container with water from the creek, just in case. Della prepared food that would keep, bread that could be eaten cold, dried meat, beans that were already cooked. They had no way of knowing how long they might be trapped inside. That night, the sisters went to bed early, but neither of them slept well. The air felt wrong. The pressure was changing, and Copper paced the cabin until nearly midnight, unable to rest. The blizzard struck on November the 27th, 1847, and it struck with a fury that no one in the valley had ever seen. It began as light snow in the morning, pretty flakes drifting down from a grey sky. Willa watched through the window, thinking it looked almost peaceful. By noon the wind had picked up and the snow fell heavier. Thick curtains that obscured the animal shelter just 20 yards away. By evening it was a full whiteout. The wind screamed around the cabin walls, finding every crack, every gap, every tiny opening in the chinking. Snow drove horizontally past the windows so thick that nothing was visible beyond the glass but swirling white chaos. The temperature plummeted. 20 degrees, 10 degrees, 0. And still it fell, dropping into negative numbers that Willa had never experienced. For 6 days, the world disappeared. The wind never stopped, never even paused. It shrieked and howled and roared, battering the cabin like a living thing trying to break through the walls. Snow piled up against the door, drifted over the windows, buried the animal shelter until only a dark shape was visible beneath the white. Inside the cabin, the sisters survived. The stove burned constantly, fed with logs from the stack along the wall. But the warmth that saved them came primarily from below, from the creek that continued its steady flow beneath the floor, its temperature unchanged despite the frozen hell outside. Heat rose through the boards, through the openings where the water was exposed, filling the cabin with warmth that held the cold at bay. On the first day, they simply waited, listening to the storm rage outside. On the second day, while the blizzard shrieked outside, Della washed their clothes and hung them to dry by the stove. On the third day, they took turns bathing in the warm creek water. Simple things, ordinary things, but things that no one else in the valley could do. Willa thought about their neighbors trapped in their own cabins, unable to wash, unable to bathe, unable to do any of the small tasks that made life bearable during endless days of confinement, burning through their firewood at terrifying rates just to stay alive. They ate well. Della prepared hot meals on the stove, soup and bread and coffee. They read aloud from the Bible and from Shakespeare. They played cards, betting with dried beans. They talked about their grandmother, about their parents, about the future they hoped to build when spring finally came. Copper lay by the fire, too old and tired to be troubled by the noise outside. But every now and then he would lift his grey head and look toward the door, as if checking to make sure the storm hadn't found a way in. On the fourth day, someone knocked. The sound was so unexpected that at first Willa thought she had imagined it. A knock? In the middle of a blizzard? Impossible. But it came again. 3 heavy thumps against the door. Willa grabbed her coat and opened the door a crack. The wind nearly ripped it from her hand, driving snow into her face with stinging force. She squinted into the white chaos, trying to see. 3 figures stood on the doorstep, covered in snow, nearly unrecognizable as human beings. Coated in ice, their faces barely visible beneath layers of frozen cloth. It was Marcus Whitmore. His wife Agnes was clinging to his arm, barely able to stand, her whole body shaking violently. Behind them was their son, a boy of 12, his face blank with the kind of shock that came from prolonged exposure to cold. Whitmore's face was a mask of ice. His eyebrows were frozen solid, his beard white with frost. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking required more strength than he had left. "We have no more firewood. My wife, she can't. Please." Willa didn't hesitate. She stepped aside and let them in. They came throughout that terrible 4th day and the 5th day after it, appearing out of the white darkness like ghosts, materializing from another world. Hollis Fletcher arrived half an hour after the Whitmores, half carrying an old man from a neighboring farm, who had collapsed in the snow. Hollis's face was so covered in ice that Della didn't recognize him at first. He had been trying to reach them for 2 days, he said, terrified that they hadn't survived. His own cabin had lost its roof to the wind on the 2nd day of the storm. Reverend Caldwell and his wife came next, supported by 2 young men from town who had found them wandering in the whiteout, lost and nearly frozen. The Reverend's lips were blue, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't remove his own coat. His wife was barely conscious. The Harris family arrived with their 3 small children, the youngest just 5 years old. The mother was weeping, unable to stop, clutching her children as if she would never let them go. They had run out of firewood on the 3rd day, she said. They had started burning furniture. Then they had started to freeze. Ezra Tanner came last, carried by 2 others who had found him collapsed in a snowdrift less than a quarter mile from the Ashford cabin. The young man who had bet $20 that the cabin would collapse before Christmas was barely conscious. His hands and feet had been exposed to the cold for too long. 2 of his fingers would never feel anything again. By the end of the 5th day, 14 people were crowded into the small cabin built over Red Creek. 14 people who had laughed at the Ashford sisters. 14 people who had called them fools. 14 people who had shaken their heads and predicted disaster. Now they sat shoulder to shoulder on the floor, on the benches, on the sleeping platform. They huddled around the stove and marveled at the warmth rising from below. They watched Della draw water from the center opening and heat it for tea. They listened to the storm rage outside and understood that they were alive only because 2 orphan girls had ignored everyone who said they were crazy. The 5th night of the storm was the longest any of them had ever known. The wind still howled. The snow still fell. The temperature outside had dropped to 40 below zero, cold enough to kill exposed flesh in minutes. But inside the cabin, something was happening that none of them would ever forget. They shared what they had. Della had prepared enough food to last the sisters through the winter, but now she divided it among 14 mouths without complaint or resentment. Soup for everyone, bread broken into small pieces, coffee stretched thin but still warm. They shared stories. Old Jacob Morrison, who had somehow survived the journey to their cabin despite his age, talked about winters past. His creaky voice painted pictures of blizzards he had survived, of hardships overcome, of hope maintained through the darkest times. The others listened, taking comfort from the knowledge that bad times had come before and been survived. The children found comfort where they could. The Harris children, exhausted and frightened, eventually fell asleep in a pile near the stove, their small bodies curled together for warmth. The Whitmore boy sat with his back against the wall, staring at nothing, still in shock from the journey through the storm. The youngest Harris child, Emma, had not spoken since they arrived. She sat in her mother's lap, her eyes wide and blank, lost in whatever terror she had experienced. Her mother stroked her hair and whispered to her, but Emma didn't respond. It was Copper who reached her. The old dog had been watching her from his spot by the fire. Slowly, stiffly, he got up and walked across the crowded cabin, stepping carefully over and around the people packed into the small space. He approached Emma and put his graying head in her lap, looking up at her with ancient, gentle eyes. For a long moment, nothing happened. Emma stared at the dog without seeming to see him. Her mother held her breath. Then Emma's small hand moved. She touched Copper's fur, stroked it once, twice. Her fingers curled into his coat and held on. And finally, in a voice so small it was almost lost in the noise of the storm, she spoke. "Can I pet the dog?" Her mother burst into tears. The sound of her daughter's voice after hours and hours of terrified silence was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. Copper stayed with Emma for the rest of the night. He let her hold on to him, pet him, bury her face in his fur when the wind howled especially loud. He gave her the comfort that no words could provide. Late that night, when most of the refugees were sleeping, Marcus Whitmore approached Willa. She was sitting by the front water opening, checking the flow, making sure nothing had shifted during the chaos of so many arrivals. She looked up as he approached, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Whitmore was a proud man. Willa had known that from the first day she met him. He was proud of his 43 years in the valley, proud of his knowledge of this land, proud of his certainty that he knew what worked and what didn't. Now that pride was stripped away. He stood before her, empty and humbled, his eyes wet with emotions he had probably not felt in decades. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, as if the words were being torn from somewhere deep inside him. I was wrong. Willa waited. We were all wrong. Whitmore's voice cracked, and he had to pause before continuing. I called this place Ashford's Folly. I said you'd be dead by Christmas. I told everyone who would listen that you were fools building your own graves. He shook his head slowly. And all along, you were building the only thing that could save us. The only warm place in this whole valley. The only shelter that could keep people alive when everything else failed. He met her eyes directly, and Willa saw what it cost him to do so. I'm sorry, he said. I'm sorry for every word I said against you, every laugh, every time I shook my head and told someone else you were crazy. I was a fool, Miss Ashford. You and your sister were the wise ones all along. Willa looked at this man who had doubted her, who had mocked her, who had represented everything she had fought against for the past 7 months. My grandmother believed in this land, she said quietly. My grandfather knew how to build. I just listened to them. Whitmore nodded slowly. Then they were wiser than all of us, he said. Before we continue, I want you to take a moment and think about this. 14 people walked into that cabin expecting to die. They walked out alive. Not because of luck, not because of money or power or connections, but because 2 young women had the courage to build something everyone said was impossible. If you know someone who needs to hear this story, someone who's been told their dreams are foolish, someone who's been mocked for believing in something others can't see, share this video with them. Sometimes the reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things is exactly what we need to keep going. Now let me tell you what happened in the days and weeks that followed. The storm broke on the 6th day. Willa opened the door to find snow piled nearly to her waist, a wall of white that stretched in every direction. The sky was crystalline blue, the air so cold it hurt to breathe, but the wind had finally stopped. Everything was buried. The yard, the animal shelter, the path to the road. The whole world had been transformed into an endless white landscape, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. They spent the day digging out. The men who were able-bodied worked to clear paths through the snow, to check on the animals who had somehow survived in their buried shelter, to assess the damage. The damage was extensive. As news filtered in over the following days, the true scope of the blizzard became clear. 4 people had died in the valley. One was an old man who had tried to walk to his neighbor's house and gotten lost in the whiteout. He was found 30 feet from his own door, frozen where he had fallen. Another was a young mother whose cabin had collapsed under the weight of the snow. 2 others had simply frozen in their homes when their firewood ran out. Dozens of livestock had perished. Cattle, horses, sheep, all buried or frozen in barns that couldn't withstand the cold. Property damage was everywhere. Roofs had collapsed, windows had shattered, wells had frozen solid. But the Ashford cabin stood untouched. The creek still flowed. The foundation had held. The roof had shed the snow just as Willa had designed it to do. And 14 people who should have died were alive because of it. Silas Hartwell never came to apologize. He never came at all. Word reached the sisters that he had lost a significant portion of his cattle to the storm and that his own house had suffered damage. Some said his pride would never allow him to admit the Ashford sisters had been right. Others said he was simply too ashamed to face them. Either way, he stopped trying to buy their land. That, Willa decided, was acknowledgement enough. In the weeks that followed the blizzard, everything changed. Ashford's folly became Ashford's ingenuity. People stopped laughing and started asking questions. How did the warm water work? How had the foundation been built? What techniques had they used? Marcus Whitmore came back, just as he had promised. He spent hours studying the construction, asking Willa to explain every detail. He took notes in a small leather book and talked about building a similar structure on his own property. Over a spring he knew of that might have similar properties. Ezra Tanner, the young man who had lost feeling in 2 of his fingers, came to apologize. He paid the $20 he had bet against them, pressing the coins into Willa's hand, even though she told him it wasn't necessary. "I was an idiot," he said, looking at the floor. "I was young and stupid, and I thought I knew everything. I'm sorry." Willa accepted the apology with grace. She had learned that there was no satisfaction in holding grudges against people who had genuinely changed. Reverend Caldwell held a special service to give thanks for the survival of so many during the storm. He spoke about the Ashford sisters, about their faith and their determination, about how God sometimes worked through the hands of those the world considered foolish. "Perhaps," he said, looking at Willa and Della in the front pew, "the Lord was not testing their judgment after all. Perhaps He was testing ours." Hollis Fletcher came almost every day after the storm. Sometimes he brought tools and helped with repairs. Sometimes he brought food, a pie from a neighbor or fresh bread from town. Sometimes he brought nothing but himself and his company. Everyone knew why he really came. He came to see Della. On a bright morning in late March, with the snow beginning to melt and the first hints of spring in the air, he asked her to marry him. They were standing by the creek, near the very spot where Della had first discovered the warm water, almost a year before. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and the world was coming back to life after the brutal winter. Hollis got down on one knee in the muddy ground, his face earnest and hopeful and terrified, all at once. "I know I don't have much to offer you," he said. "Just a piece of land and 2 strong hands and a heart that thinks about you every minute of every day. But if you'll have me, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you." Della looked at Willa, who was watching from the cabin doorway. Willa smiled and nodded. "Yes," Della said, turning back to Hollis with tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I will marry you." The wedding took place in May, 1 year after the sisters had first arrived in Wyoming. Reverend Caldwell performed the ceremony in the little church in town, but the celebration afterward was held at the Ashford cabin. The entire valley turned out. People brought food and gifts and good wishes. They danced on the grass beside the creek and toasted the happy couple as the sun set over the mountains. Marcus Whitmore gave a speech that brought tears to many eyes. He talked about the day he had first ridden over to see the crazy Ashford sisters and their impossible project. He talked about his certainty that they would fail, his mockery, his predictions of disaster. And then he talked about the night he had stood on their doorstep, dying of cold, begging for shelter. "These 2 women saved my family," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "They saved my life. And they taught me something I should have learned a long time ago. Sometimes the foolish ones are the only ones who see clearly." Hollis had built a cabin on his own claim using techniques Willa had taught him. It wasn't over water. There was no warm creek on his property, but it was tight and well built and would keep them comfortable through the winters to come. Della moved into that cabin after the wedding. It was strange at first. For both sisters, They had never been apart, not since Della was born. But Hollis's property was only a mile away, close enough to visit any time, and the sisters saw each other almost every day. Willa stayed in the original cabin. She had built it after all. She belonged there. The years passed, as years do. Della and Hollis had their first child a year after the wedding, a boy they named Thomas after the grandfather, whose knowledge had made everything possible. A girl followed 2 years later, and then another boy. The little cabin a mile away grew crowded, and Hollis built an addition, then another, until it was a proper house. Willa never married. She had proposals, several of them, from men who admired her strength and her independence. But she always turned them down, kindly but firmly. "I have everything I need," she would say. A home, a family nearby, work that matters. What more could I want? She became known throughout the region as the woman who knew how to build. People came from miles around to ask her advice, to learn her techniques, to understand how the Ashford cabin had survived when so many others had failed. She taught anyone who wanted to learn, never charging for her knowledge. Knowledge should be shared, she would say. That's what my grandfather believed. Old Jacob Morrison passed away peacefully in his sleep the spring after the great blizzard. At his funeral, Willa spoke about how his encouragement had sustained her during the darkest days of construction. How his story about his father's house had given her hope when everyone else offered only mockery. "He saw what others couldn't," she said, "and he helped me see it too." Copper died that same year. The old dog had grown slower and slower, his joints stiff, his eyes clouded with age. One morning, Willa found him lying by the stove in his favorite spot, still and peaceful. He had simply gone to sleep and not woken up. She buried him beside the creek, near the spot where Della had first discovered the warm water. She carved a marker from oak, the same wood old Jacob had used for his walking stick. Copper faithful companion. Through every storm, she visited that spot often in the years that followed, when she needed to think or to remember. She would sit by the creek, feel the warm water against her hand, and remember all the storms they had weathered together. 20 years passed. Red Creek Crossing, as the area had come to be known, had grown into a small but thriving community. There was a general store and a church, a schoolhouse where children learned to read and write, a blacksmith and a sawmill, and a dozen other businesses that served the needs of the growing population. The Ashford cabin still stood at the heart of it all. The creek still flowed beneath it, warm as it had been the day Della first plunged her hand into the water. The foundation posts, sunk so carefully into the creek bed during that first desperate summer, showed no sign of rot or decay. If anything, they seemed stronger than ever, hardened by decades of immersion in the mineral-rich water. Willa was 46 years old now. Her hair had turned grey, her face was lined with the marks of a life lived hard and well, her hands were gnarled from decades of work, but her eyes were still sharp, and her step was still steady, and she still rose before dawn each morning to check the water openings and feed the stove. Della visited often with her grandchildren. Yes, grandchildren. Her oldest boy had married and had children of his own, and they called Willa Auntie Willa and begged her to tell them stories about the old days. She told them about the journey from Missouri, about the wagon and the dust and the endless miles of prairie, about their great-great-grandmother Constance, who had saved for years to buy this worthless land, about their great-great-great-grandfather Thomas, the Cornish miner, who had known how to build things that lasted. She told them about the blizzard of 1847, about the 6 days of howling wind and driving snow, about the people who had come out of the storm, desperate and freezing, seeking shelter, about how 14 souls had survived those terrible days in a cabin that everyone had called a folly. And she told them about Copper, about the old dog who had been there from the beginning, who had supervised the construction, who had comforted a terrified little girl during the longest night of the storm. The children listened with wide eyes, and Willa knew that the stories would be passed down, generation to generation, long after she was gone. On a winter evening many years later, Willa sat alone in her cabin. She was old now, old enough that she had stopped counting the years, old enough that her hands trembled when she lifted her coffee cup, old enough that she knew the end was coming, probably sooner rather than later. But she wasn't afraid. The fire crackled in the stove, the water murmured its endless song beneath the floor. Outside, snow was falling gently, coating the world in white, just as it had fallen on so many nights before. She opened her grandfather's journal, its pages soft with age, its binding worn from decades of use. She turned to the last entry he had written, the words she had read so many times she knew them by heart. Build with the land, not against it. The earth will reward those who listen. She smiled and closed the book. They had called her a fool. She and Della both. They had said the cabin would rot, would flood, would collapse. They had said the sisters would freeze, would sicken, would die. But the cabin still stood, the creek still flowed, and Willa Ashford was still warm, still comfortable, still home. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes, listening to the water flowing beneath her, feeling the warmth rising through the floor, smelling the wood smoke and the herbs that hung from the rafters. Outside, the wind was picking up, the snow falling harder. Another storm coming, perhaps, the kind of storm that had once terrified her neighbors, that had driven them to her door begging for shelter. But inside the cabin, as it had been for more than 40 years, all was well. The cabin at Red Creek Crossing stood for more than 100 years. Generations of families lived in it, raised their children in it, found shelter in it during storms that came and went like the seasons themselves. The warm creek never stopped flowing. The foundation never failed. The walls that Willa and Della had built with their own hands continued to stand against whatever the Wyoming weather could throw at them. In 1952, a team of engineers from the state university came to study the structure. They had heard the stories, the legends that had grown up around the Ashford cabin, and they wanted to understand the science behind the folklore. What they found amazed them. The foundation posts, submerged in warm mineral water for more than a century, had essentially petrified. The minerals had penetrated the wood fibers so thoroughly that the posts had become harder than stone, stronger than anything the engineers had ever seen in a wooden structure. The building techniques, the report concluded, displayed remarkable sophistication. Whoever designed this structure had an intuitive understanding of thermal dynamics, water flow, and material science that rivals modern engineering principles. The cabin was designated a historical landmark shortly after. A plaque was placed near the entrance, telling the story of the Ashford sisters. 2 orphans who had built a home over a warm creek while everyone around them laughed. Visitors come from across the state to see it now. They stand beside the creek, feel the warm water against their hands, and marvel at what two young women accomplished with nothing but determination and the knowledge passed down from a Cornish miner who had died before they were born. Sometimes the tour guides say, on quiet days when few visitors come, you can almost hear them. The two sisters talking by the fire, the old dog, his tail thumping against the floor, the water murmuring its endless song beneath the boards. And if you listen very carefully on cold winter nights when the wind howls outside, you might hear something else. A voice. A woman's voice, strong and quiet and absolutely certain. Let them think what they like. We'll be warm while they're hauling frozen water. This is where the story ends, but perhaps for you, it's where something begins. Maybe you've been called foolish for believing in something no one else could see. Maybe you've been mocked for trying something everyone said was impossible. Maybe you've been told that you don't know what you're doing, that you should give up, that you should listen to the people who claim to know better. If that's you, I want you to remember Willa and Della Ashford, two orphan girls who had nothing but each other, an old dog, and a journal full of forgotten knowledge, who built a house over water while everyone laughed, who saved 14 lives during the worst blizzard in 20 years, who proved that sometimes the old ways, the ways everyone has forgotten, contain wisdom that no amount of common sense can match. They were called fools, but they were warm fools, comfortable fools, fools who proved everyone wrong. Build with the land, not against it. The earth will reward those who listen. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. If it touched something in your heart, if it made you think about the people in your life who believed in you when no one else did, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me about a time when you were the only one who believed in something. Tell me about the people who helped you when everyone else turned away. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about ordinary people who did extraordinary things, hit that subscribe button. It means more than you know. Until next time, stay warm, stay strong, and never let anyone tell you that your dreams are foolish. Because sometimes the fools are the only ones who see clearly. The end.
The Ashford sisters' legacy proves that true wisdom often looks like folly to the uninformed. By honoring forgotten knowledge and working with nature rather than against it, Willa and Della transformed a worthless creek into a life-saving sanctuary. Their journey teaches us that resilience, self-belief, and the courage to innovate in the face of mockery are the ultimate foundations for success. When the world says impossible, let your results be the answer. Innovation isn't just about the future, it's about rediscovering the Earth's gifts.